Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live today. Thank you to everyone joining us in our audience. We are so thrilled to have another Facebook Live for you all today. A great session lined up. Today, we'll be talking about using voting and election records to find your ancestors. We have a fantastic speaker, Melissa Barker, a great friend of MyHeritage. So we're so excited to have this session for you all. If you haven't yet, please write in the comment section and let us know where you're joining us from today. I see some of you have already commented to let us know. Let's see, we have Mary from Indiana, and Kathy from Pennsylvania, another Kathy from Buffalo, New York, Kim from Ohio, Lake Erie. Let's see, a lot of Americans, but we have Pascal from Holland, and Marco from Italy. Megan says hello. Hi, Esther. So hello, Megan. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. We love seeing return viewers here in our audience. It just shows how meaningful and important this content can be to all of you. So we love bringing you new genealogy, DNA sessions. And of course, we have a lot of past sessions available for viewing on our Facebook page. So these are available on the MyHeritage Facebook page, facebook.com/MyHeritage, under the videos section. And there you'll see lots and lots of different sessions that we've had over the past couple of years about really every topic under the sun. So many different topics. I believe today's topic is something that we haven't spoken about in the past. So in that respect, it'll be really exciting and new. And I'm sure that we have lots to learn from Melissa about election records, election and voting records. So really looking forward to that. For those of you who don't know, Melissa is a great friend of MyHeritage. This is Melissa Barker. She's a certified archives manager and public historian. She currently works at the Houston County, Tennessee Archives, and she has spoken for us a bunch of times on our Facebook Lives about different subjects. Many of her sessions have even been turned into articles that are on the MyHeritage knowledge base at education.myheritage.com. I'll put that link also in the comment section so you can take a look. And she is known really around the genealogy circles as the archive lady, because of her fantastic work in the archives, and of course all her educational talks about the subject. So we're just so thrilled to have her with us today. Before we jump in and bring her onto the screen, we would love to hear from you all throughout today's session. So any comment or question that you have, and you put in the comments section, we'll enter you into our draw today, and we'll be giving away a MyHeritage Complete plan on which is really our best plan that we have to offer on MyHeritage. So for those of you that aren't aware, the MyHeritage Complete plan is really the total best package that we have on MyHeritage. It will give you unlimited access to 18.2 billion historical records. And of course, that number is just, it is going up. It's growing every single day as we add new historical records. We're adding millions of records each week from all over the world. So, if you haven't found the record that you're looking for just yet, it's on its way. It's definitely in the pipeline. Besides for that, a complete plan will give you unlimited family tree size, access to all of our advanced DNA features, and much more. So it is a great giveaway for today. So just leave us a question or a comment in the comment section. And of course, we love stories, success stories, discoveries, user stories, anything that you've found out about your family history, maybe from using MyHeritage. So So those are more than welcome. So feel free to add those into the comment section. But of course, if you have a question throughout or any other comments, that's also fantastic. So let us know. I'm just going to bring Melissa onto the screen now to say hello to all of us. Let's see if we can get her up here. There we go. Hello, Melissa.
Hello, Esther. How are you?
I'm doing well today. How are you?
Doing really good. Coming to you from the Houston County Archives and Museum here in Tennessee.
I love seeing all the artifacts and the photos in the background.
Yep, we have a lot here on display and exhibit, just like a lot of different archives across the United States and the world. We should all be visiting these places now that we can get out.
Yeah, definitely a lot more traveling. So I'm sure many people are taking trips to archives this summer.
Yes, they are. And that's a great place to go because you can research your ancestors, but you can also research about the locality and learn about some wonderful places.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, we're really looking forward to today's session about voting and election records.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
Okay,
and
great.
Get this going. Well, now where is it? Let me get it going here. There it is. And let's look at reading view. How does that look to you, Esther?
Let me just get it up here. Perfect. Perfect.
Great.
So feel free to take it away.
All right. Well, today we're going to talk about voting records and election records. Now, some of you may be thinking, oh, this is not of interest to me. I'm not into politics. But, I've learned over the years that as we're researching our ancestors, that our ancestors are more three-dimensional than we give them credit for. Many times we just are looking for those birth, marriage, and death records, and we kind of stop there. But I'm the type of researcher that I want to know everything there is to know about my ancestors. I want to know what they have for breakfast, what are their hobbies, and yes, were they voters? Were they into elections? Were they political? You can also find other information in these types of records as well that you may not think you can find. The thing is that our ancestors are interesting. I believe that anyone who ever walked on the face of this earth has a story to tell. And part of that story may be their voting story, or maybe they were part of an election. And so don't discount these records because they're out there and we should be using them. Your ancestor story is very important. Each and every ancestor that you descend from had lived a life and they have a story to tell. So I think it's us as genealogists, it's kind of our job to find the records, find the stories, and to retell those stories so they're not forgotten. And so you telling your ancestor's story may be partly is finding some voting or election records. Are you like a Sergeant Joe Friday? Many of you may remember the show Dragnet. You remember the statement he would say, "Just the facts, ma'am." Said, but are you searching for more than just cold, hard facts? We should be, because it adds to our ancestor story. It makes them, for me, come alive again. It makes their lives interesting. And it makes me feel like I have a really rich history when I know the stories. So we are all looking for those basic genealogical records. We're always looking for birth records, death records, marriage records. Those are pretty basic. Census records, very basic. And of course, the 1950 census just came out, so that has been fantastic to look through. Deed records is sort of a basic record if our ancestors owned property. Military records if our ancestors were part of the military. But we should also be looking for voting and election records. And believe me, they're out there. And so we should be using them to our advantage. So why look for voting records? This is going to document where your ancestor lived, because wherever they voted, that's where they lived, because they had to vote where they lived. And so in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, in Africa, wherever your ancestors are from, there were elections at some point in time. This year, the United States will be having an election year. I would venture to say that almost in any part of the world, every year, there's probably some sort of an election, whether that is for a president, whether that is for the local town mayor, a constable, a sheriff, an alderman, any kind of election, maybe just a local school board election. There are elections going on all the time. They are also a great resource for filling in those gaps between the census records. Now, we know that the census in the United States was taken every 10 years, starting in 1790. And like I said, we just released the 1950 census, and England just released the 1921 census. Those 10 years, a lot can happen in between census records. And so why not look for records such as voting and election records to fill in those gaps, to know what your ancestors were up to, what were they doing, what were they a part of in between those census years. Tell more of your ancestors' life story. I know that I have my daughter, my grandson. I have other family members that are constantly asking me about our ancestors because they know I'm the one who is the keeper of the family history. Well, I mean, I could sit them down and just say, well, this particular ancestor was born on this day, married on this day, died on this day, and then that's all I know. That's kind of boring. I love to be able to tell my family members the stories that I've been able to uncover. And part of that may be having to do with election or voting records. But you may hate politics. It's really not about the politics part, actually. It's about finding records. It's like finding any other records we look for our ancestors. It's something that we can add to their timeline. It shows them in a time and place. And it also helps us to understand their mentality, where they are socially. And also, it may tell us why they moved where they moved to, why they did what they did. And so don't see it as something political. See it as just another avenue, another resource that we as genealogists can use to tell our ancestor story. So maybe my ancestor's interest was voting for the President of the United States. I'm going to show a lot of records in my presentation today. And here is an original inauguration invitation for President Lyndon Baines Johnson's inauguration in 1965. This was actually sent to someone here in Houston County, Tennessee, and we have it in our archives. So maybe your ancestor attended inauguration of a past United States president or another dignitary in another country, and you have those records. Maybe they voted for governor of a particular state or a particular country. Here is an official ballot that we have for the Tennessee's governor's race from 1954. These records are great when you're trying to figure out who was in charge, who was the leader of a particular country or a leader of a particular state in the United States when your ancestors were living. That helps you to understand the politics of the day, especially during wartime. That also helps you to understand, why did your ancestors move where they moved? Why did they take part in things that they took part in? Understanding those things can be important. And most interestingly, for our female ancestors, voting as a woman. Possibly for the first time, you could find records where your female ancestors actually was able to vote for the very first time. This is a photograph from the Tennessee State Library and Archives on their virtual photograph collection online. These are marching suffragettes from 1915. This is when they were trying to get the vote for women in the United States. So maybe your female ancestors, we all have trouble sometimes finding records for our female ancestors. Maybe they were heavily involved in this movement, and you can find records showing that. But don't also forget the local community elections. Maybe that's your local mayor, local alderman. Maybe they ran for sheriff or some other sort of local office, and you can find those records. This is a local city of Erin elections from 1954, where they're voting for mayor, for alderman, and for magistrate. Maybe you can find your ancestors listed on one of these election ballots. It's pretty cool. I actually found one of my husband's ancestors I'll tell you about here in a minute. Do not discount your ancestors' interest in politics or voting. Maybe they weren't heavily into the political side of it, but they voted. They cared about the issues of their day. So this interest, no matter how small, is part of their life story. So what kind of records could be available? These are some of the records I'm going to talk about. A poll tax. Now, we as genealogists know about poll taxes. We don't probably necessarily think about it being a political record, but in actuality, it is a type of election voting record because you had to pay your poll tax to be able to vote. And so we're going to talk about that. Voter registration records. If you're like me, I'm trying to find records where my ancestors either are listed or maybe where they have signed something, their signature. And you may be able to find those on voter registration records. Election worker records. Have you ever thought about your ancestor maybe actually worked the elections? They were part of the workforce that helped to get those elections going and got them completed. And maybe there's records for that. And maybe your ancestor was a candidate. Don't discount that maybe they ran for some sort of office that you never heard about. And so looking for those kinds of records, we're going to show you a little bit how you can find those. And again, I'm going to mention the women and suffrage records because it was an extremely important part of the United States history and for women's suffrage. And like I said, trying to find records for our female ancestors can be difficult. And this may be one avenue you can find something. And I'm going to tell you about a surprise candidate that I found using Google Books. And it's one of my husband's ancestors. So the poll tax, let's start with that. The poll tax was something that many United States citizens had to pay up to a certain point. This is actually a poster from Amarillo, Texas from the 1960s. I found this on the Smithsonian Institute website talking about paying your poll tax. There was a lot of rules and regulations about the poll tax. In fact, I just ran across a notation in some local school board minute books from the 1930s that talked about the school teachers weren't allowed to teach that year unless they paid their poll tax. So it was extremely important that these taxes be paid, and it made certain that your ancestors would be able to vote. The poll tax is probably one of the most well-known voting or election record that genealogists know about. You may not know it or constitute it as a voting record, but it is. You could have to pay your poll tax and then be able to vote. So the poll tax began in the 1890s as a legal way to keep African Americans from voting in southern states. That was the real purpose of the poll tax when it began. And so many people in the South did not want African Americans to vote. And so this is one way that they were trying to keep them from voting, because many times African Americans were some of our poor citizens and they could not pay a poll tax, which means then they could not vote. So poll taxes were essentially a voting fee. If you could not pay your poll tax, you were not able to vote. Eligible voters were required to pay their poll tax before they could cast their ballots. So you think about it, whether it's poor African Americans, sharecroppers, anyone who did not have the money to pay their poll tax did not have the ability to cast a vote in the election. 5 states enforced payment of poll taxes for state elections until the 1965-66 era. This is when the Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional. So you may think that the poll tax is something from a very long time ago, but in actuality, it was in place up until the 1960s. Those 5 states are Texas, Alabama, Virginia, Mississippi, and Virginia. And so it's important that we look at the election laws, the voting laws in the areas where we're doing research to help us guide us as to what records are available and how long those records were in place, such as the poll tax. So where are we going to find poll tax records? Record availability on these is going to vary by state, by county, depends on what's been saved, what's been preserved. But I've been able to find a lot of poll tax records when I do research in Tennessee, West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, places like that. These poll taxes were usually recorded with the property tax records. This is where you'll usually find the poll tax being paid right along with property taxes. And so many of us look for those property tax records. While you're looking for property tax records, also look for those poll tax records. The poll tax will be listed as a specific tax. It'll be specifically named on the tax ledger. And so it should be on the same page as all the other taxes, whether they paid a school tax or road tax and their regular property taxes. So you should be able to see it. But my ancestor didn't own property. You may think to yourself, well, my ancestors never owned any land, so they didn't pay property taxes, which I mean, they probably didn't pay taxes at all. Well, don't think that way, because they may still have had an interest in voting and being part of regular elections, which means they would have had to have paid a poll tax, which means they'll be in the tax register. So just because your ancestors didn't own property that doesn't mean that they didn't pay their poll tax. You may just see just the poll tax listed. They paid it, and so then they were able to vote. This is actually a tax book from 1911 from Robertson County, Tennessee, and it lists all of the different taxes that each individual person paid. If you look closely, I actually put a red arrow there to where each and every person who paid their poll tax. And so as you see, it's listed right along with all the other taxes. And as you can see down at the bottom, there are people that paid poll tax that didn't own any property, but they're still listed in the property tax books. So if you haven't been looking for your ancestors in the property tax books because you knew that they didn't own property, I would encourage you to go back and look again to see if they have the poll tax listed. Here's a tax receipt for James West, who was actually an African-American gentleman. I don't know if you can tell by his name, but there's a parenthesis with a C, which stood for colored back then. And he's paying his poll tax. In fact, he's paying all of his taxes, but part of his taxes from 1899 was the poll tax. That means he got to vote. This is in 1899. Here's another receipt for Mr. James West. It also lists him as colored, paying his poll tax for 1899. The one was for 1900. He did not own property, yet he still paid a poorhouse tax. He paid a school tax. He paid the county, state tax, and a road tax. But he also paid the poll tax. This tells me that it was important for him to pay this tax so that he would have his right to vote. Voter registration records. They are produced to register eligible voters for each election. Many of you that are listening to this, you have your own voting. You do your own voting every time there's an election. And you know yourself that you have to register to vote or be a registered voter. And when you go to the polling places to vote, you have to either sign in or show some identification to be able to vote. And so think about your ancestors. They had to do sort of the same thing. And so there should be records. These could be just a list of eligible voters for their particular area. In the United States, we are separated into voting districts, and each voting district would have a list of eligible voters for that district. These records could include a lot of different information. Believe it or not, you would not think, you'd think that this would just be just voting stuff. But in actuality, there's all kinds of information that can be found in voter registrations. So obviously their name, which can help some of us if we're looking for a middle name, if we're looking to confirm a name or a spelling of a name. The name actually could be very important. A date of birth. There are some times in our history when voter registration records require the date of birth. So if you don't have a birth record, or if you're looking for a specific date of birth, a complete date of birth, you may find it in the voter registration records. Place of residence. I have ancestors that I'm still trying to figure out where they're located. Or where they were during specific times. You may find those in the voter registration records. And so you may see the place of residence because you had to prove that you were living in a particular district to be able to vote there. So it's important that they show the place of residence. I have also seen voter registration with naturalization information. You may be looking for this information in naturalization records, can't find it. Look to the voter registration records. You had to prove that you were a citizen of that county, of that state, of that country to be able to vote. So look for this information in voter registration records. Again, if you're like me, I'm constantly looking for my ancestors' signature on things, their actual signatures. I like to collect their signatures so that I have them, an example of their handwriting. And you may find their actual signatures on voter registration records where they had to sign that they were there to vote. Their occupation. I have actually seen occupations on voter registration records. Isn't this some great information? All this information may not be on every voter registration record in every country and every state, but I guarantee you're going to find some of this information on there. So occupation, that's another great piece of information to find on any record, but we can find them in the voter registrations. Marital status is also important. What if you're trying to find out if they were married, when they married, when they divorced, what their status was that may be found on their voter record. And information about land ownership. There are periods of time when only landowners could vote. And so you'll need to check the rules and the laws of the areas where you're researching. Only landowners could vote. So if they're voting and if they're listed on the voter registration list, that means they own property, which should take you then to the deed records to try to find and determine that land ownership. Again, in the district or the area where they lived in the county, if you know they lived in a particular area, finding particular information on a voter registration list as far as the district, the area in that area where they lived might help you to also find other records. So look for that information. So here's some of examples of what could be in a voter registration list. This one is from Hunt County, Texas, from 1867. Now, this one is interesting. What if you're looking for a death record? And in 1867, I can tell you, Texas does not have death certificates at that time. But in this voter registration record, list of voters, it shows this person who's listed. They've X'd his name out, and under the remarks, it just says dead. Well, that would really get your attention, wouldn't it? So who thought that you could find death information in a list of registered voters? And you can. There's all kinds of information that you can find in these types of records. Here's another example. This is Charles Rawson in England, how he made a citizen district court. So Charles Rawson, his nativity, or where he was from, is England. And it says, how made a citizen district court. So what does that tell us? That tells us that he was made a citizen through the district court and he was from England. That will send us, hopefully, to those records to find where he was naturalized, where he became a citizen. And how do we find this out? We found this out in a set of voter records. So you just can't know what you're going to find when looking at these kinds of records. Election workers. It takes workers to run elections. And so that's something we may look for. Maybe our ancestor actually worked the elections. Maybe they were a poll worker. You never know. It's not something that actually I don't think families talk about. I know that my family has never talked about whether or not anyone actually worked for the election. I know that my husband's family, a lot of his members of his family have worked for the election. I can tell you, I've actually worked for some of our local elections. So these also can be records that you might be able to find. Now, these are just a little bit harder to find because they're not saved as much as some of the other records, but you should still be looking for them. So what kind of a worker could they have been? A poll worker. When you go to vote at the polls, you see people there operating the elections. Well, they're there working and they get paid and they may have generated some records. Maybe they were a local election judge that served on the local election board. Many of our areas have election boards. They make the local decisions on how to have elections, where to have elections. There may be records for those kinds of things. So there may be records available for your ancestor who was an election worker. And I'm going to talk here in just a minute about how to find these records. But these are some of the records I want you to keep in mind as you're doing your research. When we get to certain points in our research and we think about, well, I kind of have found everything, or I don't know where else to look, election records should be something on your to-do list. You may be able to find payroll records. Now, these are not saved as much, but you might be able to find some evidence of this. Here's an example of some payroll records from 1963 here where I live in Houston County. And it lists the people who worked, lists their address where they lived, and it shows what part they took in the election. And so if one of these was your ancestor, wouldn't it be neat to find this type of information? Also, maybe your ancestor was part of the local election board. And these election boards usually had meetings, which means they produced meeting minutes. And a lot of times in a lot of places, these are required to be kept so that they can go back and be looked at. So look and ask about local election board records and meeting minutes. You might be surprised what you find. Here are some meeting minutes of the planning committee for the Black and Puerto Rican political convention from June the 27th, 1969. Again, it lists their officers, it lists their committees, and it lists the business that they took care of. And so these meeting minutes can actually be really rich with information, not only local information, but it lists people. It lists what they did, and it lists what maybe they brought they had a problem with the election board or this particular board, and it was put into the minutes. So great information to add to our ancestor story. Maybe your election workers actually signed election returns and reports as an election worker. Again, we may be able to get a signature. This is an election return for the city of Erin from 1924. This is something we have here in our archives. And this is as you get into the election return, you can see where the commissioners, the chairman and the secretary and the commissioner has all signed this document. And so getting your ancestor's signature on any kind of document, but isn't it great to be able to have something like from an election document that they were a part of and they signed because they were an election worker? And then here is something out of the newspapers. We're going to talk about newspapers a little bit more in just a minute. Newspapers are a great place to find election and voting records. This is actually an advertisement for the citizens of Houston County appointed to conduct the general election from 1958. So what does this show us? It shows us by district, each and every person who was an election worker in that district and what office that they held in that district. So all of these names, if your ancestors in one of these names, it would be something I would love to be able to find. And so newspapers are a fantastic resource. So what if your ancestor is actually a candidate? We may not know that until we start looking in these records. Maybe your ancestor actually ran for an office of some kind. Maybe they ran for school board, or maybe they ran for an office that you didn't even know about. That happened to me. I found my husband's grandfather running for an office. I'm going to show you that in a minute, that the family didn't even know that he ran for. So it's great information to find. Maybe they ran for a local office or a state office or something even higher. You never know what your ancestors have done until you uncover the information. And how do we do that? By looking in all of the records that we can find at our disposal. So did they run for secretary to road commissioner? This is the one that I found. This is my husband's grandfather, Lanny Barker. He owned a local store. We never knew that he ran for an elected position in the community, but he did in 1970. Now, unfortunately, he didn't win it, but he ran. So it was very interesting for us to find this piece of information. It adds to my husband's grandfather's story. It tells us a little bit more about him, that he cared about his community, that he wanted to be part of the election process, be part of helping to make his community better. And it was a great find that I actually just happened to find in the newspaper while I was looking for something else. Did they run for a school board member? Maybe they were extremely interested in local education. And so they decided to run and to be elected to be on the school board, something that we may think about. Did they run for town marshal? Maybe they were into law enforcement. And so maybe they ran for town marshal. Here's another great newspaper article. It's undated, but it says at a meeting of the board of mayor and alderman, James Richardson, formerly connected with the Zeph Roby's store, was elected town marshal. And it says Mr. Richardson will work with O.E. Beecham, the other marshal of the town. So fantastic information. If James Richardson was your ancestor, I would think that would be pretty darn cool to find that he was elected as the town marshal. And we're back to women and suffrage. Again, trying to find records for the women in our family can be difficult. This is one avenue that we may try to find those records. In the United States, the women did not receive the right to vote until 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Actually, Tennessee is known for casting the deciding vote. Mr. Harry T. Byrne of the Tennessee House of Representatives actually changed his vote because of a letter he received from his mother asking him to change the vote. He listened to his mother. He was a good boy. So were our female ancestors involved in the fight to get the vote? That's one thing as an archivist where I am now. I've been trying to find records for our local women to see if we had any organizations or any groups that were fighting for suffrage. It's something that I look for my female ancestors. Were they on the bandwagon for suffrage? Did they go out in march? Did they write letters? Were they part of a group of women who fought for this right for United States women to vote? Organizations at the local and state level produced records during the campaigns, during the fight, during all that they did to get the right to vote. Many of these records are going to be at the local area. They may be at the state level. They may even be at the federal level, because this was a nationwide United States fight to get the vote for women. Again, I'm going to say this more than once, but newspapers are a great tool to find your female ancestors in any way, shape, or form, but also their involvement in such a movement as women's suffrage. And so use newspapers to the greatest ability. One thing I like to encourage genealogists to do is to sit down, and when you're on microfilm, or maybe you're looking at digitized newspapers on MyHeritage or another database, read those newspapers from page 1 to the last page, because you never know when you're going to find something for your ancestor. And a lot of times those search engines don't pick everything up. So where are the records? Where can we find these records? You're probably thinking, okay, Melissa, I'm excited now about these voter and registration records, but where am I going to go to find the records? Well, newspapers. Newspapers are my go-to place to find a lot of things. And so newspapers, if you're going to find that ancestor that was a candidate, maybe you can find that woman in your ancestry that was part of the suffrage movement. Maybe she was part of a local group and they had an article in the newspaper and she's mentioned. So newspapers are a fantastic place to find this kind of information. This is actually from a newspaper. This is the unofficial general election returns from that election that my husband's grandfather was in. And so he got 785 votes. I can see that. He did not win, but it shows all the people that he ran against, and it shows where by district he came out. But this was published in the newspaper. This is actually the sample ballot that was published in the newspaper. So not only can I see that he ran for this particular office, but I could actually see the sample ballot that everyone saw when they cast their vote in 1970. He actually ran 2 times for this position, never did get it, but I can actually see the actual sample ballot, and it was published in the newspaper. Manuscript Collections. This is a fantastic place to find election and voting records. If you don't know what Manuscript Collections are, they are in almost every archive imaginable, whether that's United States, Europe, Canada, Africa, Australia. They all have manuscript collections. So this is how I describe a manuscript collection to someone. I want you to think about all of the genealogical records that you have in your possession, whether that's census records, vital records. Maybe you have scrapbooks and diaries. You've got grandma's quilt. You got your mother's wedding dress, all those kinds of things. Box them all up and take them down to the nearest archives and donate them. That is a manuscript collection. So as you can imagine, each and every manuscript collection is going to have different things and unique things and original records. Here's some examples. We have actually a election and voting records collection here in our archives, and these are actually some ephemera that have survived. These are some candidate cards that they would hand out during the election. Here is a sign that we have for someone who was running for county court clerk. This one was interesting for me because it says your vote and support will be appreciated. This is from 1954, and it lists his accomplishments of what he's been able to do for the local community. And so very interesting. Mr. L.F. Stone was really well known in our area. He ran for a lot of different offices. And so he had his cards. Each time he ran, he did something different. And this is something different as well, that L.F. Stone actually owns Stone Amusement Company. And it shows here that he actually printed the general election ballots for the local election. So I thought that was pretty interesting. You never know what you're going to find in a manuscript collection, and this is a perfect example of that. Vertical files. Vertical files are fantastic record collections. These are normally in file folders, in filing cabinets. They are what I call a hodgepodge of records. You never know what you're going to find in vertical files. They're normally indexed by surname or subject name. And so talk to the archivist or the librarian. They should have an index for you to look at, and you can look for your surnames and look in those files to see what's in there. And these records can be found at any local archive, historical or genealogical society. You can find them on online databases. MyHeritage has election and voting records on there for not only the United States, but for several other countries. I would encourage you to go there. State archives or state historical genealogical societies. I always try genealogists to go local, start local, look for those local archives, local historical societies. And then I would go to the state level. And then I would go to the federal level because there are federal records as well. And don't forget college or university libraries and archives. Many people kind of discount those because they think they just have college records. They do. But if you think about colleges and universities and how they're set up, they are part of the local community. And so many times if there are records, historical records, local historical records, or even genealogical records, when there's no place for them to go, a lot of times they will end up at a university or a college. I know many university and colleges that have personal diaries, scrapbooks, photographs. So go to these places to look for records for your family. And museums, don't forget museums. I actually came late to the idea of museums being a source for genealogy. But when you go to museums and you see a Civil War letter on display or a photograph on display or a diary or a scrapbook, you can bet there are more of that sitting in boxes, in shelves, and back rooms of museums. So use museums to your advantage as well. This one I threw in is something kind of fun that we found in our archives. Elections in Fudge Pie. This is actually an election ballot from 1952. Nothing abnormal really about it. Shows you who's running for mayor, alderman, and a great document for local history. But when we found this document, we looked on the back, and there's a fudge pie recipe on the back. So what a fantastic local piece of history. And yes, I can tell you, I actually made the pie and it turned out pretty darn good. We don't know who wrote the recipe. Obviously, probably a poll worker, an election worker, probably was sitting there, maybe kind of bored, waiting for voters to come in. And someone asked her for her fudge pie recipe, and she wrote it on the back of a ballot. So, something fun to share with you today. So, a surprise candidate. This was a surprise candidate for me for my husband's ancestry. And I actually found it using Google Books. Now, I encourage genealogists to use Google Books. Go there, punch in your surnames, punch in your ancestors' names, look to see if you can find something. And so I do this periodically. And this one time I did this, I actually found information on my husband's third great grandfather. His name was Jesse Glasco. He was born in 1814 and he died in 1892. And so Jesse Glasco was more than just a voter. I have been able to find a tremendous amount of information, not only on him being a voter, but also being his being a candidate. Here is some information about Jesse Glasco, who he married. He was actually part of the 83rd Illinois Infantry, and he there died March 29th, 1892. But Jesse was a voter. Not only was he a voter, but he was a prolific voter. He voted, I think, every time there was an election, which tells me a lot about him. He was very, very concerned about his local community, about the way his community was operated. That tells me a lot about him. So here's a little bit of his voting history. He voted in the U.S. presidential election in 1852. Here is the document for that I was able to find at the Stewart County Archives in Tennessee. As you can see, he's listed on a list of voters. He voted for governor in 1853. 1854, he voted for justice of the peace. And I can go on and on. He's 1855, 1856. Again, he voted for presidential election. In 1858, he voted in the local county elections, again for governor, and then again for, like I said, he voted every time there was an election. And yes, I have got documentation for each and every one of these elections, just to show you that it can be found. And I don't know about you, but it really adds to his story. Now, this one here is what I found on Google Books. In 1865, he ran for U.S. Congress. We never knew it, and it wasn't something I probably would have found if I hadn't been going through Google Books. But he was a voter. He voted every single time. So August 3rd, 1865, he ran for U.S. House of Representatives. How did I find this? Again, I searched Google Books. But what I found actually had absolutely nothing to do with him himself. What I found was in the miscellaneous documents, House of Representatives, 1866 to 1867. What had happened is that election there was a contested election, a contested local election, and in order to determine who the actual winner was, they collected all of the election information and they did an investigation. Well, part of that information that was found, the controversy was between Dorsey Thomas and Samuel Arnell, who was contesting the election. But what I found is in all of this reporting, all of this investigation, Jesse Glasgow is listed as have receiving 4 votes in that election. Now, it had nothing to do with the contesting of the election. It was kind of a byproduct of the fact that all of this information had been collected in this investigation. But I found it by just searching for Google Books. This is actually the election returns from that election. I was able to find that at the local Stewart County Archives. And as you can see, he got 4 votes. He was already elderly at this time. I don't understand why he ran for office, but he did get 4 votes. Obviously, he did not win, but evidently he put himself out there and he tried. So don't be surprised if you can find a candidate in your family. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation of election records and voting records. Don't think about it as being something political. Think about it as another fantastic resource to finding information about your ancestors and telling your ancestors' story. So please visit my blog, A Genealogist in the Archives. If you have any questions after this presentation, please email me at melissabarker20@hotmail.com. And with that, Esther, I'll be glad to answer any questions that we might have.
Okay, let's see. I'm just getting the screens set up again. Let's see. I think we're back in business. It seems a little bit slow.
I was wondering, are you there?
Sometimes the internet, it becomes a little too heavy. But we do have nice questions here from the audience that we've collected. So I'd love to ask you some of them, Melissa, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. First, I see a lot of, comments about people who learned a lot throughout today's session. So Barb wrote us. She said, "I'm getting excited to look at voter records." Carolyn said, "Great presentation." Kathy said, "Please keep that website address up. I didn't have time to write it down." So maybe we'll add it to the comments after. We'll add all your details there so everyone can take a look afterwards as well and still access. So we do have a few questions. The first one, let's see. Carolyn said, "Are these records usually found at the state or the local level?"
Local elections will normally be found at the local level. If you have state elections, guess what? You're probably going to find election records at both because you yourself know when you vote, you're voting for your local representatives, your state representatives at your local election. So I would look in both places.
Okay, Heather asks, "How recent would voter records be available?"
I'm sorry, repeat that again.
Heather asks, "How recent would voter records be available?"
I think it depends on the area. I know that I can tell you that in Tennessee, we are considered a sunshine state. And so I don't think personal voter records are available. But, I know we have voter records up to the 20th century and going back to the 1800s. I think it just depends on what's been saved, what's been preserved. And also think about your area or the state's retention schedule, meaning what rules and laws do they have in place that says that a particular area is required to keep records for this amount of time, whether they're permanent records, whether they're temporary records. So that's something you have to kind of look into as well.
Let's see. Amy has a question about archives in general. She said, I'm under the impression only the archival librarian is allowed to go into our library archives. Is this unusual?
It's not unusual, but I will tell you that if you work with a local archive, especially if you're going to come from out of town to visit, talk to them, email them, call them, ask them for a tour of the archives. I encourage genealogists to do that all the time, because as you're taking that tour, pay attention to the spines of books to see what those records are, or boxes. What are the labels on the boxes of what kind of records there are? Talk to the archivist about what kind of records do you have. Ask for that tour so that you can familiar yourself with those back rooms and what kind of records they may have. Because when you're at an archive, you're sitting in the research area where there's like just tables and chairs. You don't know what all they have. It's also always important to get a good idea of what maybe is located in a particular archive.
Very, very interesting. I find the archives so fascinating, the workings of the archives. Let's see. Kathleen said, great info. Thank you. I just happened to see it by chance. So yes, and there was another question here at the very beginning, I believe, by Wayne, who said, how do you get notice about the Facebook Live videos? So just so you all know, we do post from time to time on our blog, blog.myheritage.com, with a schedule of all of our upcoming Facebook Lives. Some of them may get rescheduled or get moved around due to certain concerns, but in general, we tend to keep to that schedule. So make sure to pay attention on the MyHeritage blog for new info about upcoming Facebook Lives. Let's see. Tony asked, Tony said, thank you for the very informative presentation. Are there any records from war veterans who wanted to vote and were overseas at the time of the election?
To be honest with you, I've not seen some records like that. But although there may be records, I tell you what I have seen, and I don't know honestly if this is unique to Tennessee or if it happened across the United States. But you remember me talking about the poll tax, and we all know about the poll tax. I know that the state of Tennessee actually gave waivers to veterans, World War II veterans, because of their service. They did not have to pay the poll tax, and I actually have records here in my archives for that. So I know that did happen, that they did get a waiver. They did not have to pay the poll tax, that their service served as their payment, as you will, to be able to vote as a poll tax.
Wow. So I think that's pretty much all the questions that we're going to take today. Thank you so much, Melissa. What an interesting session, and all those examples were just so fascinating. So thank you so much for bringing those forward. And now we get to give away a MyHeritage Complete Plan, the best plan that we have to offer on MyHeritage. We did get a lot of entries, some really incredible stories. So thank you everyone for writing in, a lot of great questions and comments. And our winner today is Amy Drown Harris. And Amy wrote to us and said, as a child, when Dwight D. Eisenhower was running for president of the United States, his campaign sent postcards to all the voter populace. This postcard included a picture of himself and his wife and children. It belonged to my maternal grandparents, William Herman Cohen and Ruth Christina, and is now in my possession. I cherish this because my grandfather was a naturalized German citizen and very proud of becoming an American citizen.
That's wonderful. Congratulations.
Yeah, so congratulations, Amy. Please message us to claim your prize. And thank you for sharing that, that nice little story about that heirloom that's been passed down in your family and what it means to you and your family. Just lovely to hear that. So Melissa, thank you so much for today's session. Definitely very timely with a lot of elections in the pipeline for this year.
Yeah, thank you for having me so much, Esther. Y'all have a great day.
Yes, and thank you to all of our viewers in the audience for joining us today. And we hope that you all have a great day. So thank you all for joining us. Bye.
Bye.